Welcome to Finanspanelen, the finance panel. My name is Pehr Wissén. I work at the Swedish House of Finance at the Stockholm School of Economics. And together with SNS, we are producing this seminar series. And this morning, we are very proud and happy to have Jason Furman visiting us. Jason Furman was former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration and is presently senior fellow, is that the title, at the Peterson Institute in Washington. And he is here to share with us his view on the U.S. economy. And he has promised to speak for roughly 45 minutes, and I think we'll do that uninterrupted, not the academic way with interruptions all the time. But after that, we will have 30 minutes for sort of your views on things. I mean, you don't have to ask him questions. If you don't agree, you say so. Or if you have questions or whatever, and we will have 30 minutes for that. So once again, very much welcome. And please, Jason Furman, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, this seems to work. Okay, good. Well, it's great to be here in Stockholm and talking to all of you. And I picked a topic that I would have at least comparative advantage in relative to most of you in this room. So hopefully we won't need the interruptions, at least for now anyway. Today's talk, I'm going to start with the short-run outlook. And when I was in the White House, that was a lot of what we thought about every day. I was there from January 20th, 2009 through January 20th, 2017. And in the beginning, of course, it was the financial crisis. And, even all 8 years, I never slept super well because I was always a little bit worried that the Eurozone crisis, China, some development in the United States might affect our economy. And I used to go on TV about once a month to talk about the jobs numbers whenever they came out. And the moderators on TV would always ask me about monetary policy and what the Fed was going to do next and what the short-run outlook was going to be. And every time I had the same answer, which is that as an administration official, we respect the independence of the Federal Reserve and don't comment on monetary policy. So I was really excited to leave the government, become a private citizen, be able to say whatever I want. And my first television interview after leaving, I'm like, you're going to ask me about monetary policy because I can finally talk about it. And they're like, oh, no, we're not really that interested in the short-run economy. It seems fine. Can we talk about fiscal policy? I'm like, why didn't you ask me that last month? So part of my theme is going to be that the short-run outlook, you never know. There's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. All sorts of things can happen. But as far as what we can tell, the short-run outlook seems right now relatively boring and relatively where we'd want it to be. I think the more interesting and important questions are around the prospects for long-run growth, around some structural challenges in the United States, inequality and labor force participation, and then what President Trump's agenda, how it affects all of that. So let me start, though, with the short-run outlook, and I'll start with the labor market. This is the unemployment rate. The blue bar is the average over the last business cycle. And as you can see, it went up a lot, as we all know. It came down, and at 4.2%, it's now below the average of the last business cycle. People who have argued for more slack in the economy have said we need to look not just at the official unemployment rate, but also, for example, at discouraged workers. If you look at discouraged workers, they're basically right back where they were before the recession as well. And then if you take the most expansive measure of unemployment, you would and labor underutilization, you would add in people who are working part-time for economic reasons. That's people who would like a full-time job and can't find one. That is, you'd have to squint. It's a tiny bit above its previous average, but also coming down. You add all three of them together and you get a measure called U6, which is the broadest measure of labor underutilization, and that had been elevated long after the unemployment rate was. That, too, is back below its pre-recession average. Pretty much at almost any statistic on the labor market, with the exception of the labor force participation rate, which I'll come back to, you see this recovery. So just to give one other important example, the quits rate is above its pre-recession average, so people feel confident enough in the economy that they can quit their jobs and go find another one. And the rate of job openings is tied for a record high, although that series only goes back to 2001. You're seeing this labor market tightening to some degree in inflation, but only to some degree. If you look, the core PCE, the Fed targets the PCE, and they target 2% on it. And on both a regular basis and a core basis, it's been hovering a bit below 2% for the last several years. That gives the Fed a little bit more space and room to operate without fear. They've been reasonably clear that their 2% inflation target is symmetric and that they're as concerned about deviations below as above, although I think there's some question in whether their actions to some degree treat the 2% as a ceiling. In terms of wages, you've seen some evidence of tightening the labor market when you look at wages as well. The next slide, this is Goldman Sachs combines 4 different measures of wage growth, and this is nominal wage growth. And you see that sort of gentle upward slope in it with wages, nominal wages now growing at 2.5%. That's well below the wage growth we saw in the previous business cycle, but there's 2 big reasons for that being lower than it was. The first is that inflation is lower than it was in the last business cycle. So that blue bar was real wage increases in the last business cycle at 1%. In this business cycle, I think that's 0.8, maybe it's 0.7%. So when you adjust for inflation, some of the difference in wages goes away. And then the bigger factor, and one that I'll spend a lot more time talking about, is productivity. And if you look, it gets a little bit messy, but average productivity growth in the last cycle was 2.5%. In this cycle, it's 1%. So in some sense, we don't deserve to have the types of rapid wage growth that we had in the last cycle because we're not having the productivity to generate and support that wage growth. So if you look at something like unit labor costs, they're running ahead of inflation right now, just like you would see in an economy that is tightening and starting to run out of slack. I think there's still a little bit more, and this is the IMF's measure of the output gap, which is basically, for the most part, disappeared. They project it'll disappear in 2017. Personally, I think there's a bit more room. We'll talk about the participation rate later. There's a number of people that have dropped out of the labor force who might be brought back in by running a hotter economy for a period of time. Personally, I would err on that side, but I don't think there's a huge amount of room. And to really generate both GDP growth and wage growth going forward, we're going to need more productivity and less inequality, which is most of what I'm going to talk about now. But just very briefly to put one slide up on the short-run risks and opportunities. And that's the point there, that the blue is potential growth, the orange is cyclical growth. We were getting a big cyclical boost to growth from the unemployment rate falling. There's not a lot more room for it to fall. So in the last 2 years, we've gotten relatively little cyclical boost to growth, and I wouldn't expect very much cyclical boost to growth going forward. It's that blue part, which is the labor force and productivity, that will need to grow. Before we turn to that, just one slide that doesn't do full justice to the short-run risks, but at least can start a conversation that we can come back to, the short-run risks and opportunities. In terms of, the opportunity side, you've seen since the election a number of measures of confidence and optimism go up. You see that in the consumer data. You see that especially that yellow line, which is CEOs, which actually I've done some analysis of in the past and is a really great lagging indicator for how the economy is doing. Small businesses are sort of a coincident indicator, and consumers are a little bit of a leading indicator. And then housing, that's builder optimism, has improved a little bit too. So there's a lot more optimism. There's been a puzzle, though, as to whether this optimism is or isn't translating into economic performance. If you look at the first quarter of this year, for example, consumer spending growth was very weak. And if you look at the historical relationship between confidence in the economy on the part of consumers and consumer spending, they're sort of all on a line, and this point is way off that line. It's much worse than you would have predicted. So it may be that part of what people are saying is that Republicans are much more happy than they were. Democrats are like a little bit sadder, but haven't changed as much their perception of the economy, and that's disconnected from the actual decisions that people are making when they're deciding what to buy and how to behave in the economy. So that's one possibility for confidence. A second possibility is that people will be disappointed if the things they're confident about don't materialize. A third possibility, though, is that that's good news and we'll have some self-fulfilling positive developments. And there's some evidence for that and the fact that business investment has picked up. The right-hand side shows you what people who are betting their money think about what's going on. And in the expectation of fiscal stimulus, you saw a big jump up in the yield on treasuries and in the U.S. dollar in the wake of the election. Most of that increase has retraced, almost all of it in the case of the dollar and most of it in the case of the 10-year treasury, as expectations of fiscal stimulus have, at least in the market, gone down. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to give my own prognostications, but they're mostly in the down direction on the odds of stimulus happening. We'll talk a little bit about that. So there's a little bit in the short run that we're worried, that one wants to watch. Some opportunities in terms of confidence, some worries in terms of disappointment, high valuations in the stock market, U.S. banks very healthy. The global situation has somewhat less tail risk than it's had over the last several years, although still quite a lot of uncertainty. And the Fed on a very predictable, data-dependent path of tightening, where they're really watching the incoming data, and it'll be interesting to see what they do this week, because the inflation data softened a decent amount since the last set of speeches prior to their blackout period. So that's the short run. What I am more excited about and interested in is the long run prospects for the U.S. economy. And here we're having a bit of a debate in our country over what they are. The administration has set the goal of 3% growth and built a budget that was premised on that prediction. Most private forecasters are predicting growth of around 1.8 or 2%, and I am very much on the side of the private forecasters, and that was the forecast that I oversaw in the Obama administration, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. The biggest factor is one that's common to all of the advanced and most of the major emerging economies in the world, and that's just the demographic headwind to future growth. This shows the prime age population, 25 to 54, and in the 1980s it was growing at about 2% a year, and now it's growing at about 0% a year. We have, especially in the Republican Party in the United States, a little bit of a sort of religious worship of President Reagan. And, you'll often hear he had 3%, he had deregulation, he had tax cuts, he had 3% growth. If we have deregulation and tax cuts, we'll have 3% growth. But when you look at that demography, it turns out that the same productivity growth that we had in the 1980s would get us a growth rate not of the 3.1 we had back then, but of 1.7% right now. And so this demographic fact is with us. It's not going to change. and there's relatively little one can do about it, although one can affect the fraction of the population working, which I'll come back to. The other thing that we've had in all of the advanced economies is a slowdown in productivity growth. I used to show this chart when I was in the government, and then I would always point out that the United States at least has the highest of any of the G7 countries. But the bigger lesson, of course, is that everyone has gone down, and in fact it's gone down more in the United States, in part because we had a burst of productivity around the internet concentrated in a decade in a way that you didn't see in any of the other G7 economies. We can talk in the Q&A about the sources of this slowdown. I think part of it is caused by the weak demand in the wake of the Great Recession. We've had less business investment, and you look at the capital services per worker is actually down over the last 5 years, as opposed to being up for every other 5-year period since the end of the war. And so that part of productivity growth, I think, could rebound as business investment picks up and is not something like we've run out of ideas. Part of it, though, is total factor productivity growth has slowed. That's like the most important thing in the economy and the least understood and predictable part of the economy. There's at least some evidence, though, that it's become more costly to innovate. If you look at drug trials, for example, you have to spend much more money and do many more trials to get an incremental new drug. So while we've invented new technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning, they haven't lowered the cost of innovating. And in fact, they can be quite costly to adapt and move into new sectors and new areas. If you look at the outlook for growth, if you see there, productivity growth has been, depending on which measure you're using, running at about 1% over the last decade. The expectation is that that will rebound somewhat, and when you have a 1.8% growth forecast, the population growth is slower than it was before. That's relatively fixed and predictable. The potential labor force participation rate, that minus 0.4, just assumes that on an age-adjusted basis, participation stays the same. So that purely reflects retirements as the population is getting older. And I think there's some downside risk to that, which I'll talk about. To think the economy is going to grow at 1.8%, you actually have to somewhat optimistically assume that productivity growth, after being terrible for a decade, is going to bounce back to something like 1.7%. So if anything, I wouldn't be hugely surprised if the number was below 1.8 rather than above. And to get a sense of what the range of possibilities are, I just did a simple Monte Carlo, which draws from historical labor force participation changes by age and gender, hours changes, productivity changes, draws from the variance-covariance matrix for all of them, and simulated what the growth rate would be, and it has a median of 1.8. The 95th percentile is 3%, so that's certainly possible, but not something I would recommend anyone build a budget on. And the 5th percentile is 0.7%, which is also possible and probably a little bit too pessimistic to build a budget on. So that is just a quick tour of economic growth and the economic growth outlook. And again, we can come back and talk more about anything you all want to talk about with that. But what I wanted to turn to next is the challenges of inequality and labor force participation. These are two issues that are disproportionately big issues for the U.S. economy that I've spent a lot of time on. They're less on the policy agenda today than they should be, but I suspect they will come back. The first is something that I think everyone knows. This is the share of the income going to the top 1%. And the United States is, by this measure, the highest of any of the major economies and has risen faster than most of the major economies, and this is one of many ways of measuring inequality, all of which tell roughly the same story. While shows market incomes, though. We've made a little bit of progress. This next chart shows the share of the top 1% in income. Blue is market income. It's what you earn. It's your job. Orange line is after taxes and transfers. And you can see that taxes and transfers lower inequality and have actually done a better job over time in lowering it. The difference between those two is the set of bars on the bottom. And not shown here, this data ends in 2013. In 2014, the Affordable Care Act went into effect, and a set of taxes associated with it as well. So you'll see a jump up in that bar when we get the 2014 data as well. So we've made a bit more progress over time in dealing with inequality, but only a bit. And in fact, if you look at all of the advanced economies, for most of them, you've seen an increase in inequality. For most of them, taxes and transfers has offset a portion of that inequality. So inequality after taxes and transfers has risen less than it did before. Sweden is actually one of the few exceptions to that. Inequality after taxes and transfers, at least in the Luxembourg data, has gone up more than it did before, but you have a lot more space. I should say at an OECD meeting, which I used to chair the Economic Policy Committee there, I once was looking at the Swedish data and said out loud that Sweden was doing really well and at this rate would catch up to the United States in inequality in the next 40 years. And I had intended it as a joke, and the Swedish delegate was very earnest and raised her hand and told me that she didn't think that was a good thing, and Sweden wasn't aspiring to be number one in the world in inequality. So anyway, I'm glad we have a sense of humor here. So the inequality discussion is one that we've actually been having for a while in the United States. I was at the Council of Economic Advisors in the 1990s, and we do an annual economic report, and one of the chapters that I prepared or helped Joe Stiglitz prepare was on inequality, and that was in our report in 1997. So we've been having this conversation for a while. A conversation that we are newer to in the United States and that we're starting to pay more attention to is the labor force participation rate. And I don't have a graph showing this, but from 1948 through 2000, the labor force participation rate was going up. So people weren't paying a huge amount of attention to what was going on beneath it. And what was going on beneath it for men, this is men 25 to 54, so it's taking out the demography, it's taking out any effects of aging. The fraction of them working has been falling continuously from 1952 through the present. Used to be that 98% of men that either were in work or looking for a job. Now it's 88%. And so if you do the inverse of that, that's a 10 percentage point increase in not working. A typical recession is something like 2 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. So in some sense, that line on the left is 5 times what you would see in a recession, just happening slow motion over the course of many decades. The reason we didn't see that in the aggregate data is what was going on the right-hand side, which is women were entering the labor force from the 1940s up until about 2000. And notice the scales are really different. So a little movement on the right-hand side vastly outweighs what you're seeing on the left-hand side. But in the United States, that changed in the year 2000. And women have actually seen their labor force participation rate declining since 2000 at a time when most of the advanced economies are still increasing. If you look at how the United States compares to other countries in this regard, the left shows the change for prime-age men since 1990. The United States has had the second largest decline of any country. Only Italy has had a larger decline. Sweden, and yellow there, has had a small decline. So I think this is something everyone needs to worry a bit about, but we need to worry like 4 times a bit about it. And for women, Sweden had a decline. You can all explain that to me. The United States has basically been flat, while most countries have increased over that period. You see the same thing in levels. The United States is basically, for men, tied with Italy, and we're ahead of Israel. There's a lot of men in Israel who do what they might call non-market labor of studying the Talmud and the like. So other than countries that have either completely dysfunctional labor markets or very different cultures from the United States, we're the lowest. And for women, the countries that are lower than us are places like Turkey, Korea, Italy, and Ireland that also are culturally different in their attitudes towards women than the United States, at least, aspires to be. We could talk a lot more in the Q&A about the causes of all of this. I think it's a bit of a challenge for some of our standard views of labor markets, though, because we do have the most flexible labor markets in the OECD, the lowest minimum wage, the lowest level of unionization, all of the standard orthodox recipes for a functional job market we've done in the United States, and it hasn't worked. So that, to me at least, says you need workplaces that are more flexible, which affect female labor force participation. You need more job search assistance, training, lifelong learning, investments in community colleges, and a range of other things to create the type of connective tissue that either public policy or, in some cases, labor unions create in other countries. When you combine the 3 things I've been talking about, the productivity growth rate, which has slowed, inequality, which has risen, and labor force participation, which has fallen, the 3 of those combine together into this, which is basically like a sufficient statistic for the economy, which is the rise of median family income. So median family incomes were rising at 3% a year for decades. At that rate, once a generation, your income doubled. Now they're rising at about 0.4%, which means roughly once every more than 100 years, incomes double. And I think that in some senses is the central challenge that we're facing. And to deal with it, we need faster productivity growth, we need less inequality, and we need more people participating in the workforce. Which brings me to President Trump's policy agenda. And I'm probably not entirely unbiased on this question. I have tons of Republican friends. My advisor was a Republican. I would love nothing more than to be more positive and more cooperative, and I will do my best, and you can all judge as to whether I've succeeded or failed. I'll talk about fiscal policy, regulation, immigration, trade, and then very briefly about international cooperation. Tax policy is the most interesting debate, and the big question there is, are we going to get tax cuts, which would be defined as just lowering tax rates and not trying to pay for it, or are we going to get something like tax reform where you get rid of loopholes and you pay for your tax changes? I personally think the United States is really in need of tax reform. Our corporate tax rate at 35 at the federal level and 38 including states is the highest of any country in the world, with one possible exception. We have a narrower tax base than most countries do too, so we don't actually collect a lot of revenue. And we have an international tax system that's badly broken, where we basically, unlike most other countries in the world, we pretend to tax you on your worldwide income, but then we don't actually tax you on it. So we create a lot of distortions while raising relatively little revenue. If you look, part of what's going on right now is a little bit confusing because President Trump put out a one-page tax plan that all of his advisors, in typical fashion, told the newspaper that they didn't really like that much, but the president made them do it. And the House Republicans have put out their version of reform, which in some ways is quite different. So the president would cut the corporate rate to 15. House Republicans would cut it to 20. House Republicans would allow businesses to expense all their investment and get rid of the interest deduction. This switches to a more consumption tax, cash flow tax. And they have something called border adjustment, which would, you're all familiar with it because you have it for your VAT, but it wouldn't tax any income associated with exports and would not allow deductions of imports, so effectively would tax imports. On the individual side, the House Republicans are actually more aggressive. Oh, sorry, that should have been 35, not 37. Sorry, that's a typo. I thought I'd corrected that. The House Republicans are more aggressive in cutting rates, but they're also more aggressive in base broadeners. They get rid of a lot more loopholes. So when you look at the bottom line, oh look, now it got corrected to 35. So when you look at the bottom line, the president's principles would cost $5.5 trillion because he has more aggressive corporate rate, has a pass-through rate also of 15%, and doesn't get rid of a lot of loopholes. The House Republicans, their goal is zero. There's some debate about where they are. They're probably missing by about $1 trillion, but nothing close to $5 trillion. And then there's the share going to the top 1%. In President Trump's campaign plan, it was 50% of it went to the top 1%. He changed it some in office, so it seems like it might be as low as 1/3. For the House Republicans, 99% of it goes to the top 1%. So one of the big debates now is which of these two routes we'll take. The House Republicans are being, I think, quite principled in pursuing the approach they're doing. From my perspective, if you just took that top individual rate and raised it, you would hit your goal of zero. Your top 1% number would go down from 99, and you'd have a reform that actually would be very pro-growth and very good for the economy, and that's what I personally would like to see. That's politically difficult, though, and it has winners and losers, and absent cooperation from the Democrats, you're not going to have something with winners and losers. So I think the much more likely thing is a milder version of the second column there, something that's more of a pure tax cut. In terms of the economic impact of that, if you have a pure tax cut, you get an economic benefit from lower tax rates. But you also have an economic cost from higher and rising deficits. And this is one estimate of the net effect on GDP. It comes from a nonpartisan organization, the Tax Policy Center, and it was actually done by Kent Smetters, who's both an expert in this area and an economist from the Bush administration. And it shows you get a little bit of boost to GDP up front, mostly from the Keynesian effect, and to some degree from a supply side effect. But then the deficits just mount and grow and grow and grow. So after about 10 years, output is down, and output continues on a downward path relative to the baseline as a result of it. That's taxes. The next big thing in fiscal policy is infrastructure. The administration last week, all of last week, was supposed to be Infrastructure Week. It got overshadowed by a set of other news in our country, as often happens these days. And there the president has made two proposals on infrastructure. One is to invest $200 billion in additional infrastructure through incentives for public-private partnerships or for private investment. But then he's proposed also to cut traditional public funding for the highway and train program. And when you look at the net effect of those, this isn't an economic analysis, this is just the dollars from the president's budget, it would have the effect of initially adding some money to infrastructure, but then the additions go away and the cuts to the highway program grow, so it actually would be a medium and long-term reduction in public investment in infrastructure in the country. I think if you got the first part of that, that would certainly be good for the economy and positive. What's important to note, though, if you're doing a macro analysis, $50 billion is 0.2% of GDP. You don't get to $50 billion for another 3 years, and there's not a lot of congressional support for this because Republicans are less interested in infrastructure than the president is, and Democrats don't like the president's approach of shifting to privately financed infrastructure and cutting the public financing. So I think the odds of this passing aren't super great. And if it did pass, you'd only get a couple 0.1% of stimulus out of it anyway. Just to put down the rest of the budget, there's an 8% increase in defense spending. Then that's paid for by a large cut in non-defense spending, including things like a 19% cut for cancer research. This week actually is, in the administration, they're making it Employment and Training Week, and they're touting the investments in training or in one training program. But if you look at all the training programs as a whole, they've proposed a 34% cut next year, cutting financial aid for college, et cetera. The other thing the budget has is 2.5 trillion, that should be trillion, decrease to low and moderate income programs over the next 10 years. Most of that is in subsidies for health insurance, or program for health insurance for low income households, and then also repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. So relative to any budget under President Bush, this is a much, much more dramatic cut to low-income programs. I mean, the equivalent to that 2.5 trillion under President Bush would have been, I don't know, 100 billion, 200 billion. I mean, it would have been 1/10 what that was. These cuts on the non-defense side are some the likes of which were never proposed by President Bush. So it's a very, very radical budget in that respect. And I should say a lot of it's so radical it won't happen. There's no support in Congress, for example, for cutting cancer research by 19%. I don't think there's any Republicans or Democrats, or very many, who would support them. If you look at the fiscal outlook under this budget, the blue line is the Congressional Budget Office's baseline. It shows deficits rising from 3 to 5% of GDP. If you did the president's budget without his tax cuts, you would put the deficit on a downward path. They claim balance with 3% growth. I'm using the nonpartisan assumptions for growth. If you add in the tax plan, you get a bigger increase in the deficit up front, but that would eventually go away as the spending cuts outweighed it. So just to put the rest of the agenda down on regulation, there's been an interest in reducing regulation across a number of sectors. So far, it's actually been outside of climate, which is a really important exception. So far, it's actually been much more minor than I expected. There was a rule that Republicans hated that we did out of the Department of Labor for retirement savings. The administration said that they're going to keep that. They're coming out today with their proposed reforms to financial regulation. They're expected to be quite modest. And so it's really in the Environmental Protection Agency that you've seen things that are quite large. The, legislatively, it'll be hard to pass any deregulation. Administratively, I think you'll see it more over time as more political appointees are in place. But a lot of the regulatory issues we have are at the state and local level, which the federal government has relatively little impact on. And based on a range of studies on regulation, I think this could add 1 percentage point to the growth rate over the next decade, which isn't a measure of social welfare. So it might hurt you in terms of the environment or whatever, but measured in terms of growth rates, it's 0.1%. Immigration is a little bit unclear what's going to happen there, but certainly if you had restrictions to legal immigration or increased uncertainty for people who aren't supposed to be in the country but are, that would reduce the growth rate. It would compound the demographic problems I was talking about before. And another big wild card is trade. If you look at the president's campaign proposal, it was a 45% tariff on China and a 35% tariff on Mexico. That would undo about 80 years' worth of tariff reductions that we've done in the country. We haven't seen anything like that, but there has been an increasingly aggressive use of anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and other measures like that. There's a process that started as to whether we could use a national security argument to reduce imports in areas like steel. And if you look at the share of imports covered by the new set of orders from the administration in its first 100 days, you've actually seen a decent-sized jump in the share of imports, both from China and from countries other than China, that are covered by import restrictions. Not across the board, nothing as high as 35 or 45%, but you see that under the hood. And the United States Trade Representative, who's in charge of trade negotiations, is a very experienced lawyer in using creatively and aggressively the whole set of tools that are available under the law on sort of a product-by-product basis. I just have one more picture for all of you, and it's the change in the U.S. Multilateral role, and it's one that I don't think requires a whole lot of sophisticated and complicated explanation. But I guess I should have put an X over that. But the United States is, at least in the near future, at the federal level, going to be playing less of a multilateral role. At the same time, several states have signed up, California, New York, Vermont, and others, to participate in the Paris Agreement and abide by the emissions reductions goals from the Paris Agreement, and also to abide by the goals for emissions reductions in the regulations that we had put in place that have since been stopped by courts and are likely to be rescinded by this administration. So I think you'll see more and more multilateralism happening and enthusiasm for it, just less so from the President of the United States, but everyone else still loves the rest of the world. So in conclusion, the United States is at or near full employment. I'd love to see more wage growth. For the most part, we're going to need productivity growth to get that wage growth. Going forward, we'll probably have growth of about 2%, assuming that the unfavorable demography continues, which is a very safe assumption, and that productivity bounces back, not to its high levels of the past, but to its level of the last couple decades, which is a reasonable assumption, but very uncertainty. Inequality and labor force participation are really compounding that low productivity growth, leading to slow income growth. And finally, when you look at President Trump's policy agenda, I think there's some things that could add to growth, like less regulation, some things that could subtract from growth, like less international openness and less openness to immigration. On net, I would think it would be, if done, a small negative for the growth rate over the next decade, but a much larger increase in after-tax inequality. Thank you. Okay. Oh.
Over there, and I try to make this work. It works. So the floor is open. You suggested 3 areas for discussion, questions, comments, the sources of the low productivity growth in the US and in international comparison, and how do we understand the changes in labor participation rates in the US, and you have been a comparison with other countries, and the changes in inequality. So those are 3 possible areas. While the audience is thinking, can I try one on the productivity? A little while ago, I read the Brynjolfsson McAfee, The Second Machine Age, where they argue that we've seen periods in history before where the system has invested heavily in new technology for maybe like a 10-year period, like we have been doing now. I mean, all the investments in self-driving cars and the Internet of Things and all of that is a burden on productivity as long as sort of no output comes from it. And we may be in such a period. And they claim that sort of a couple of years from now, soon we will have self-driving trucks on the roads and self-driving cars, and then we will see an explosion of productivity when all this technology sort of is being put into commercial use. Sort of, I would be just interested in your comments on such a optimistic view on the world.
I used to place more weight on that view, and every year the productivity statistics have beaten me down and made me, more and more dour about the future. But no one can predict this stuff. It's really hard to understand. To make the case for them, it's the case when you have a new innovation. Sometimes it's not that it doesn't help productivity for a while. It may actually hurt it before it helps it. So think of bookstores. Let's say you have a lot of small bookstores, independent bookstores, and then big chains like in the United States, Barnes & Noble and Borders come along. When they first come along, they set up these really large stores. They hire a lot of people, but the country isn't actually selling any more books than it used to, but it has more people employed in jobs trying to sell books to people. So productivity, book sales per bookstore worker goes down. But then the small bookstores go out of business. The large ones are more efficient, and the number of book sales per bookseller, go up. So you would see this down before you see an up. And there's some evidence that some of the past technological waves we've seen, like electrification, that followed that pattern. The other thing is that you need to readapt society to things. So electricity is only useful if houses install electricity. And if you change the factories from being in the city to the suburbs, and instead of building factories up, you build them flat, and make a whole bunch of changes like that take a while to figure out. And so we could be in the infancy of figuring that out. The three things that make me worried about that possibility, though, is one, we're seeing a lot of innovation in the economy, but it's still in a relatively small part of the economy. And if you spend all day staring at your phone, and like in my case, it's only half of my day staring at my phone, you can think we're making all sorts of progress. But a lot of the other things we do are eat in restaurants, or sleep in our home, or go get medical care, or go to a university, or take a bus or take a trip. Most of that doesn't have anything resembling the same degree of innovation and change. So, to some degree, you need Brynjolfsson and McAfee to be right that we have lots of productivity growth in 10% of the economy, so that when you average it out with the other 90%, we even get to the 1.7 number that I was assuming going forward for the growth rate I showed. So that's number one, is that we may see what they see, but we just see it in a small part of the economy. The second is the bigger story of what we've seen, and this has been going on for a while, as I said, is, and Chad Jones and co-authors have a paper on this, is it's just becoming more expensive to innovate. We're spending a larger share of our GDP on private R&D than we've ever spent on private R&D. There's way more research happening in companies, and there's less output for that research. And so for whatever reason, it's just becoming more expensive to innovate, and so we're running up against that. And then just the third is just the more simplistic, that we just haven't seen it in the data yet, and waiting one more year is becoming less likely. But I hope that's all wrong, and I think there'll be some places that we do see big changes, and certainly self-driving cars would be decently high up on that list.
Thank you. I've seen Arvid's hand in the air. Wait, microphone.
Oh, thank you for an excellent presentation. I have a question which you can leave to the end, but eventually it would be very interesting to hear you tell somewhat of what's an average week at the White House like. Have you been there for 8 years? I don't think most people in this room know much about ordinary daily life in the White House. So if you could spend a few minutes on that topic in the end, it would be interesting.
Okay, I'll save that for the end.
Okay, I remember that. Anna?
Well, thank you again for a very nice presentation. I have one question on productivity. Some people argue that it's simply a mismeasurement problem, that you actually have a lot of innovation, but it's hard to measure, especially in the services sector. So I'd like to hear your view on that. And the other question I have is actually on the Vice President, Pence. So given the current situation, you can speculate whether Trump will actually stay for the full 4-year period. So in case Vice President Pence would become the president, what would his economic policy look like? Would it be the same as Trump, or would it be different in some way? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So, want to do your second one first. I think on most of the economic issues, it would be reasonably similar. On social policy, it would be very different and much more conservative and less tolerant. On foreign policy, I'm not actually familiar with his views, but my guess is it would at least be more predictable and understandable than our current president's foreign policy. But on economics, the economic team functions strangely there. The Treasury Secretary is a Democrat. The director of what's called the National Economic Council is a Democrat. The person in charge of the budget's a Republican. Not just a Republican. He's from, do you know the Freedom Caucus? Does everyone know the Freedom Caucus? So right wing of the Republican Party. So the budget director came from that. He wrote a budget, I think, that no one else in the administration looked at. I think in our administration, it was always a team process, and we'll talk about team-oriented processes when I get to Arvin's question at the end. I think they just weren't paying attention. He wrote this budget that was way to the right of what any president, to my knowledge, has ever proposed. And so that, I think, is pretty much a reflection, though, of the vice president, who I think was paying attention and has taken the conservative side. I think on some of the regulations, you could see possibly a more aggressive deregulatory approach from Pence. I think Trump has sort of not paid a whole lot of attention to what a lot of the agencies are doing. So he picked a conservative for the environmental agency, and that person's being very aggressive. His first pick for labor couldn't get confirmed, and the second one is a little bit more moderate, and he's not really being pushed in a more conservative direction by the White House. So they're all sort of doing what they want to do. I can imagine a President Pence imposing a little bit more uniformity, but I think to a first approximation, most of this wouldn't change very much. In answer to your first question, absolutely we mismeasure productivity. Productivity growth is higher than the official statistics. That's always been the case, too. And I am very skeptical that mismeasurement has increased. And I am exceedingly skeptical that mismeasurement has increased by 1.5 percentage points. So if productivity growth was 2.5 and now it's 1, you need to be mismeasuring 1.5 percentage points more than you used to, and I don't think that's the case. There's a couple of reasons for this skepticism. One is there's some parts of mismeasurement that we actually have pretty good ways to measure, even if we don't incorporate it into the statistics. And the parts of it we can measure, the mismeasurement has actually gone down in the last 20 years, not up. And the two biggest ones there are the production of hardware, technological hardware. We mismeasure semiconductors, all that. But we make a lot less of that in the United States than we used to. So that if it's a constant level of mismeasurement, it's times a smaller fraction of the economy, so it matters a little bit less. The second one is the way we measure overseas income. Our corporations report a lot of their profits overseas that really should have been in the United States, that really were earned in the United States. That actually leads us to underreport our GDP because we take their word for it to some degree. And studies that have attempted to correct for that say it used to be like 0.3 off our growth rate. Now it's 0.1 off of our growth rate. So that's number one. Number two, if you look across countries and look at the productivity slowdown, it's uncorrelated with the share of your economy that's in hard-to-measure stuff. It's not the case that you see a larger productivity slowdown in places that have more technology where we think the mismeasurement is the second thing. Third, if you just look at productivity growth in the sectors of the economy we measure well, that's gone down a lot. So we're reasonably confident that for 90% of the economy or 80% of the economy, productivity growth has gone down. And then just the last thing I'd say is to just use a little bit of introspection. When I hung out with Arvin, Lena, and Lan Ling at the London School of Economics in 1992-93, if we made a plan with each other, we'd make it by phone. If somebody didn't show up when you thought they were going to, you would find a payphone, call it and check your voicemail to see if maybe they had left a message explaining why they weren't there. I didn't use email then, even though I was in a different country than most of my friends, and certainly didn't use the World Wide Web. A decade later, cell phone, email, Amazon, Google, eBay, etc., and all of that was in the period of really strong productivity growth. So I think a lot of the innovations that we mismeasure the most, we saw more of them introduced from 95 to 2005, 2008, and since then, some of that's flattened out. Like, Waze has made my life much better in the last 5 years, but other than that, there hasn't been a change nearly as dramatic as what I had experienced in the decades before that. So I don't think mismeasurement explains this.
Thank you. That was, by the way, Arvid Wallgren from SEB and Anna Breman from Swedbank who asked the questions.
Well, in general, when people ask two questions to people when they're in government, they choose which one they want to answer. So it's always a bad thing to do if you have an aggressive question. But anyway.
Good morning, Matt Sanderson, Riksbanken. Sure, my question will, of course, reflect my lack of understanding of the U.S. healthcare system. But if I understand it correctly, also with the Affordable Care Act, there is a number of people in the United States who are out of the healthcare insurance, but they don't participate in have access to health insurance. And that proposed to me that there is also a lot of people who are who don't consume as much healthcare as perhaps they should be in order to participate fully in the labor market. You have both people who are completely out and people who don't have good enough health to participate and produce at appropriate level, so to speak, of what they could do. And that means that you have a much lower productivity or labor participation rate than you might perhaps see in Europe from this aspect, while at the same time, if I remember correctly, you have, 18% or something like that of your GDP goes into healthcare. So you have a huge mismatch here. And of course, what I'm after here is a even wider Affordable Care Act, so to speak, would actually increase productivity and labor participation, i.e. growth. Is it something I miss here? Or?
Yeah. I mean, we could spend all day on that topic. Just briefly, previous attempts at health reform had done a little bit more of a blue sky process. How would you redo the whole health system? When we did it, we said, let's build on the existing system. If you are in employer insurance, for the most part, you can stay in that. If you're in government, for the most part, you can stay in that. And then we're going to add stuff to it that fills in the cracks. And that made it more politically possible to pass it. It made it less disruptive to most people than it would have been, but it has the downside. So there's still, we've cut the number of uninsured in half. It was about 50 million, now it's about 25 million, so that's a huge thing. Of those 25 million, some of them are undocumented immigrants who, by law, are not eligible for this new benefit. Some are in states that chose not to expand Medicaid. The federal government pays 90% of the cost. Half the states have expanded, half haven't. And then some of them are people of moderate income who the subsidies just don't seem to be generous enough to get them in it. And neither our administration nor this one enforces the mandate very strictly. There's a mandate for health insurance, but it's for the most part not very enforced. So that was, in a sense, the bargain. My view of that bargain is you want to get something in place and then you can build on it over time. So I certainly think we should toughen up the mandate, increase the subsidies, and have a public option for places that don't. That would be also not that radical. It would build on the existing system, but you could get about half of those 25 million uninsured through that. There's obviously more radical things like single payer. I think they have a certain amount of merit to them. I don't think they're going to happen in the United States. So I think it's fine to advocate for. Does this explain the labor force participation differences? It may be a part of it, but I don't think it's the biggest part.
Okay. Thank you. I don't want to miss the week at the White House. So now I've seen 3 hands. So maybe if we take 4, the questions quickly in a row, and then you can choose from this smorgasbord whatever you want to. 5. Okay, Fredrik.
Thank you very much. You said in the beginning that you were very happy to talk about monetary policy now, in your present position. So I'm going to ask you one. You seem to be, like many others, very relaxed when it comes to the normalization of policy rates. But could you say something about the sort of unwinding of non-traditional monetary policy measures, and will that be a smooth process, or could we expect some disruptions on the way? Thank you.
Okay, Staffan, I think, was next. Staffan Hansén from SPP, over here.
Thank you. In your opinion, what are you most worried about when it comes to President Trump's economic policy agenda? And what do you think could tip the financial markets over in a short or medium term horizon when it comes to the economic policy agenda?
Okay. A microphone.
Hello. I have a question regarding border-adjusted taxation. I know it was in the highlight, in the spotlight at the beginning of the year, and European trade lawyers were preparing to file a lawsuit against U.S. for possible passing this. What is your take on? I mean, it will have. People were saying that it will have a very disruptive effect on the rest of the world's economy. What is your take on border-adjusted taxation? Thank you.
List is growing. Mia, sorry.
Yes, I was wondering your outlook for the long term. What type of impact do you think that, given that you're right in terms of your projections, it will have on voters and the elections to come?
It was the... There.
My name is Ingrid Wallen Johansson, and I'm a macro analyst at Swedbank as well. I wanted to go back to labor force participation, and female labor force participation leveled out around 70%. And one of the things that strike me is that could be about childcare and family leave. And one of the things that's come out of the Trump administration that's a change from previous Republican administrations is that they're actually discussing family leave. So what are your thoughts on the need for the U.S. to expand family leave and affordable childcare, and do you see that happening under President Trump?
So you have 10 minutes, this neat little list of questions, and then you must tell us about one week at the White House.
Sometimes when I get lots of questions, I try to figure out something that encompasses a number of them, but that's going to be a bit of a challenge with these. So maybe I'll just take them in turn. In terms of monetary policy, of course, the big uncertainty there is who's going to be leading the Fed a year from now. Janet Yellen's term ends at the end of January. Republicans have had a very hawkish attitude towards monetary policy. President Trump appears to have a very dovish attitude, and so how he finds sort of acceptable Republican to keep interest rates low will be interesting to watch. I am pretty relaxed, though, about at least if the Fed continues to operate the way it's operated. I think it's been really slow in a good way. Sweden, like your monetary authority, was a little bit faster than we were to raise rates, and that probably wasn't a good thing, but lost my comparative advantage on that topic. So I'll go back to the United States. We've been very slow, very data dependent. I think the types of unwinding of the balance sheet that we're talking about are the equivalent to 25 basis points, 50 basis points a year of rate hikes, and so that's layered on top of the others. I think it could have more interesting implications for financial markets and the price of this asset relative to that asset. So I think financial markets will get disproportionately or appropriately excited about what's going to happen to the 10-year versus the 8-year versus like whatever. But I don't think any of that is going to be a huge macroeconomic import relative to the amount of discussion that it all gets. I have a broader worry, and this was Jeremy Stein's Jackson Hole paper of last summer, that we have a safe asset shortage in the world, that we're going to have less short-term assets being provided by the central bank, and what that will do over time. On the what am I most worried about in financial markets, I think a little bit like the answer to my Fed question, so these two at least I can link, is different. So stock prices, who asked that? Oh, right, yeah, thank you. Stock prices are the present discounted value of the share of GDP going to corporations. I care about GDP. I don't care per se about the fraction of it that goes to corporations. So I think some things that we could see might increase the share of GDP going to corporations. They might even increase measured GDP, but they won't increase the things that I care about, which are national welfare. So I think there's the main risk to financial markets is disappointment, that there was this euphoria after the election, a lot of it based on things like an infrastructure stimulus that I am, like, of all the things I've talked about, most certain is just not going to happen. But I think we've seen most of that unwound over the last 6 months. If you look at infrastructure stocks, for example, they're back down to where they were before. So, I'm sure financial markets will figure out some way to cause some havoc and chaos in the next 5 or 10 years. I don't see quite where it's coming from, and there's a good chance it actually won't be President Trump's fault. I'm most worried about immigration, because I think that could have the biggest impact on our growth rate over the medium term, and the biggest impact on our society and the things I care about outside of the economy. So that I worry a lot about, but the stock market isn't going to move a lot in response to immigration restrictions. Border adjustment, I've written a paper on the topic. It's the most sensible thing that anyone has written on the topic, because everyone's like in two warring camps with lots of passion, and this is really judicious and balanced and reasonable, so you should read it. And it should be on the Peterson Institute's website somewhere. And I think my brief version is, I think it should be understood as a tax policy, not a trade policy. I think it's a reasonable way to do taxation, but I think the impact it would have is the dollar would, for the most part, strengthen. It wouldn't affect trade balances. The main international ramification it has is all your corporations would want to report all your profits in the United States, because we'd stop taxing your profits, and you don't tax them when they're earned overseas either. So the United States would become the world's largest tax shelter, and to defend your tax base, you'd have to do something like border adjustment as well. So I don't think it's a real trade issue. I think it would be a good equilibrium for the world if the world all switched to this, because there'd be less mobile income and less income that escaped taxation. That being said, this administration, I think, doesn't understand what's good, and Congress often describes it as a protectionist measure, and they would market it as such. They might build in a set of exceptions that make it more protectionist, in which case, if we did it, we'd deserve the retaliation we could get. And the other thing I should say is this has been like a really exciting academic topic. It's not going anywhere. The White House is opposed and the Senate Republicans are opposed. So I don't think it's going to actually happen. But it's been fun to think about. This says long-run impact. What was that? Oh, the long-run impact of...
If you're right, what will happen to...
Oh, politics, of course, politics. I knew it was something I was trying to dodge. I'm not an expert in that, but I think you'd look at things like the income growth I showed, the inequality I showed, and it's hard not to believe that that's having a pervasive impact. There's been a big debate since the election of how much of it was cultural attitudes, how much of it was the economy. I find that debate a little bit stale because, one, it seems like both, and two, if you think it's like all racism for Trump, like why do we have this racism now and we didn't have this racism 10 years ago when people were voting for Obama? So I think you have to have something that's changed over time. And some cultural things have changed, like the pace of marriage equality or things like that. And some people react against that. But I think a bigger thing that's changed is the economy. And that people that are disconnected from our economy and society entirely, which that labor force participation shows, I think is particularly troubling for our politics. And there's a larger educational divide in voting now than there used to be. And there's also, education is very correlated with that labor force participation as well. So I think it worries me. I don't fully know what the solutions are, though. The problem is I showed that we've gotten better at dealing with inequality over time. Not good enough, but better. And that takes the form of tax and transfer programs. I think people at the 40th percentile that are voting for Trump are less voting for him because they're upset about how much the top 1% gets, because he wouldn't exactly be your choice if that was your worry. But they're worried that somebody at the 20th percentile is getting even more than them from the government. And so I worry that there's this global consensus that let's have free trade and distribute the gains from trade in a way that countries like Sweden do really successfully, that might exacerbate the political problem rather than solving it. And the thing that would solve it is more people working and more people having higher market incomes. And we know some ways to do that, but we don't have some magic lever that will change that overnight, is my worry. Family leave, the two countries in the world that don't have family leave are the United States and Papua New Guinea. Somalia has family leave. I don't know if it's enforced by their government, but it's on the books, and it's on the books in every other country in the world. I think that's appalling and should change. There's been an increased movement towards changing it. A lot more corporations are doing it. You look when a corporation announces family-friendly policies and you do an event analysis, their stock price actually goes up, so I think more of them think it's a good business practice. And and the Ivanka plan is actually, I had proposed one in the State of the Union process internally a couple of years ago that involved using the unemployment insurance system, which was a little bit, and same as the spirit of the Affordable Care Act, sort of smaller, easier way to graft it onto our existing system. We ended up not proposing that and proposing it a different way, and then her proposal is almost out of this memo that I had written internally. So I think it would be a perfectly good thing. I think it will be hard to pass, though, for the same reason that I mentioned for infrastructure, which is that Republicans aren't as excited about it as the president's daughter is, and Democrats aren't excited about doing anything with this president. And so, but I think it's part of the sort of things take time. They need to be proposed. People need to get used to them. So my guess is in the next 10 or 15 years, we will have something like that. I just don't think it'll be in the next 10 or 15 months. Okay. I think there was one more question that was left. And I also worked on the White House for 3 years in the Clinton administration, so total of 11. I mean, it's a hard question to answer. I'll give you what a day looks like, and then I'll give you a tiny bit about what it feels like. The White House Chief of Staff does a morning meeting. The thing at the White House is there's more of the governing happens out of the White House than happens in most other countries. So the president has a personal economic staff of 80 people, not counting the budget office, which is basically part of the White House too. So things get less delegated to the Treasury Department, the Department of Labor, and others. In the White House, the Chief of Staff has a morning meeting at 7:30 every day. And what was great about that meeting is the top legislative advisor would be there, the top communications advisor, but also, me for the economy and the national security advisor as well. And so it would be a real mixture of politics and substance. For me, the president had a weekly scheduling meeting, and as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, I went to that. Most of the time I paid very little attention because I wasn't overly interested, where he was going when, but they'd be like, oh, he's visiting a steel mill. I'll raise my hand, here's what's going on in steel lately, here's how it intersects with our policies. And so I always felt for my own job like I had two existences. One was in the West Wing, where I was the most economic person, and that's what I had to bring to the table, not politics, because there were a lot of people around the table that did politics. And then I'd go back to Council of Economic Advisors, and my staff would be running regressions and doing all sorts of stuff like that. And my comparative advantage there was helping to shape their work so that it would be more relevant economically. President Obama definitely, much more than Clinton, believes in people in their lanes. So he wanted economic advice from me. I had all sorts of political opinions, but anytime I shared it, I would get sort of teased and mocked for my naivete. And, that was a sort of good thing, because in exchange for me being teased and mocked for my political naivete, if the president's communications advisor or legislative advisor, President Obama's, tried to give him economic advice, he would have teased and mocked them. So on balance, I prefer that over the alternative system. Clinton was a little bit more fluid in people sort of doing both and integrating both. The way Obama would run meetings, I also liked, which is we started out with PowerPoints where we'd read the PowerPoint to him in the room, and it didn't take long to notice that he, while you're sort of reading every word on the PowerPoint you put lots of work into, he's rapidly flipping through it and then puts the whole thing down and is glaring at you, and you're still reading page 2, and he's gone through page 10 and he's glaring at you. And some people figured out more quickly than others that probably wasn't the best way to do something. What we learned pretty quickly, though, is that he reads everything he's given. And so you get a memo into him before the meeting, he reads it, and then the meeting is much more like 1 or 2 slides that are the basis for a strategic discussion, rather than imparting a set of information. A lot of people who do memos in circumstances like that are so excited to do their memo that they share every bit of wisdom they've accumulated over the course of their whole life. I used to be the gatekeeper for those, and I would often compromise with them and take that part of their wisdom I thought wasn't necessarily what the president needed, and make it an appendix to the memo. And then we would get these memos back marked up from the Oval Office, and to my horror, he was reading, underlining, and marking up the whole appendix part of the memo too, at which point I started to feel really guilty that somebody who's also making decisions about Afghanistan is reading about measurement error and productivity or something like that. That one might have been my fault. Not everything I'm saying fully translates to the current White House, but I can only tell you the one I'm with. And then I guess the only other thing I'd say is, I've never watched House of Cards. But my understanding of House of Cards is one that doesn't resemble the Washington I know at all. The Washington I know is people that are incredibly collaborative. I think on the national security side, there's a little bit more the Pentagon always thinks this, the State Department always thinks that, and they always fight with each other. On the economic side, most of our meetings were wow, this is a really hard problem. Here's my idea. Here's what's wrong with your idea, but a way you could change it. And here's what, sort of a collective brainstorming that was less about each department representing its point of view and more about people trying to figure out a problem. If a memo went into the president, generally you would want it to get other people's names on the memo, and the more you made it look like the group's idea as opposed to showing off and your idea, the more likely you were to get it done. And I would say most people understood that. So it wasn't like there wasn't a certain amount of fighting, but that was not the dominant part of it. And then for me it was great also because I discovered relatively early on that I liked a lot of different issues and bouncing around between them. And so for me, I had a job where in any given day I would do a major macroeconomic issue, but I'd also do something on reforming the patent system and changing the retirement benefits system and the economic impact of sanctions on Russia or something like that, and get to do all of those in one day. So I don't know. So it was a fun place to work. I don't know that I'll ever work there again. I don't expect to. But it's, I don't know. I guess that answered part of your question.
Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you for sharing those experiences from the White House. Thank you.